fascism and its pursuits, a particular model of it with Claude Rains as the symbol of the fascist from the, I think it's 1946, right after the war, and written during the war, Hitchcock film Notorious. So the plot to this is laid out in one of the sources. So the purpose of this is partially to present fascism according to one prevalent usage or Sprachspiel, which seems to be very powerful. Like Robert Reich seems to appeal to it, and quite a few people seem to appeal to it, which is the Henry Wallace version, because Henry Wallace, the vice president, in 1944, still during the war, wrote this sort of piece for the basically the state newspaper, the New York Times, on American fascism, where he suggested that he used the phrase used after the American Civil War, which is the recent unpleasantness, and he says once the current unpleasantness ends, in order to say there's a civil war between the fascists in America and the fascists in Germany, but once it ends, then we have to be on watch. And then the first thing I should point out is we have a statement of what fascism is from the point of view of the actual theorists of fascism, Giovanni Gentili, who was a personal student of Croce, who had revived Hegel in Italy, and who had, with Mussolini, produced a statement which I'll try to put it in the notes, actually, because there's an audio version of it on YouTube, which is good. But so that would be the theoretical version of fascism, and it's totally different than the usage amongst, especially Democrats, I think, in America. Which so this usage, the crude version is basically it just says people who are for money and power rather than human beings are fascists. And then, that has such a wide application, it's easy to see how it could be applied. And then this version of, he spins some story about how, the Nazis will set up after the war in South America and try to use their, say Claude Rains was a sort of radical historicist in the sense of Leo Strauss, who thought that through the manipulation of every subject matter being subject to presentism and therefore being rewritten all the time, we could manipulate the media then for our these pursuits, and then you could sort of make by analogy say, is this what the OSS and the CIA and the people under the U.S. aid and the small part of U.S. aid which was devoted to the Byron Engel stuff, to the it was called for the time something like the Office of Public Safety or something like that, which were populated by a bunch of CIA people who came to the conclusion that counterinsurgency and policing amount to the same thing, in the sense that if you have so-called democratic societies, Nation of Islam, Black Panthers, I assume the Nation of Islam must in some way have been neutered somehow. It's continued all these many years. It has very mainstream representatives in a certain sense, and the guy, he actually interviewed Kristen Stewart in one of her better interviews early on. Tavis Smiley, who used to be on PBS, is sort of somehow, I don't know if he actually attends Nation of Islam meetings, but he's somehow a mainstream guy that's in contact with this kind of movement. But of course the Black Panthers and other movements were actually, they sent people in to undermine them and then destroyed them. And likewise with other movements that didn't have anything to do with, I mean, that wouldn't be the only, I mean, it's just as much Branch Davidian or right-wing groups. I mean, usually in America, one kind of says the Democrats currently are connected to certain minorities, especially African Americans and some working class whites, and then with sort of upper middle class whites who their enemies put down as the so-called limousine liberals, Fear Ligeti or this type of person. And so I didn't want to just give the example of the Black Panthers, which would seem to be an example of Democrats, but also examples that would link up to the people connected to the takeover of the White House and all that stuff that were pardoned. These groups also would be considered, insurgents that would require police action in the widest sense, starting with that theme. So if you look at fascism as something which is independent of saying Mussolini's fascism, or by connection, I mean, Hitler didn't call himself as fascist. He called himself, I don't think he ever called himself that, even though he was linked up with Mussolini. I think they just called themselves National Socialists. But I mean, there is the direct link in the sense that Mussolini gave up being a communist because he gave up the international, because they were, one, they were pacifists, and two, I think because he switched over from the internationalist to the nationalist version of politics. But if you look at the Gentili version, you see that it's not really about these things that are put in the Henry Wallace version, which are quite simplistic. So in the Henry Wallace version, I think let's just try to show where there's a genuine problem, which is that what he says is so long as we're dealing with monopolists and monopolists on the side of power and money, sort of Gordon Gekkoists, then we have the bad form of capitalism. But then there's supposed to be this other form of capitalism, which isn't the Hitchcockian form. So like Hitchcock also, and The Man Who Knew Too Much, has one of his villains is asked what he does for a living, and he says, I buy and sell things. So it's like a financier. And but what is that supposed to be? The other version, the good capitalist. The good capitalist is supposed to be connected to the version of the free enterprise system, where free enterprise, we can use this phrase in order to say equal opportunity, link it up to equal opportunity, and then you have the Powell Memorandum and all that. So in my opinion, the Powell Memorandum is read schizophrenically by people like Chomsky, who are sort of thoughtless, or not thoughtless, but just mentally ill. I think when he talks about philosophy, when he talks about linguistics, he speaks perfectly sensibly, and he may make some mistakes, but everybody makes mistakes in intellectual things. But as soon as he speaks about politics, he just goes into a kind of mental illness, which is equivalent to, on the left, seeing Elon Musk as giving the Nazi salute, or on the right as seeing chemtrails, or, I knew a guy, he looks up at the silvery trail coming out of the plane at a great distance, and there he has a great deal of experience with chemtrails. That's his experience. You can't tell him otherwise. Now, of course, these things, you can always say the way we see the direct experience is informed by this long, everything we've heard about chemtrails, for instance. But then if you look into it, then there's never any time when we find out that anyone was observed manipulating these planes or putting in the chemicals in the planes, excepting if you would say the mere fact of allowing pollution in the air through the they call them contrails, which is sort of dishonest in a way, because even though they're mostly water, they're also the chemicals from the fuel. But to link them up to a scheme to deliberately, has Prince, the musician Prince, told Tavis Smiley to deliberately make the population aggro or whatever, would have to be proved some way, and it's not proved. And in fact, there's no evidence whatsoever in that direction. So that to just see, in the same way, if we just read the Powell Memorandum or something, what it says is, yeah, there's this thing called free enterprise. It means equal opportunity. When Henry Wallace wrote the article, we weren't talking about the equal opportunity in the 1960s sense of the Civil Rights Act or anything like that, but rather just that two people could compete equally in the sort of athletic contest of life for whatever is available without any special prejudice, free enterprise. So he wants us to say both that this is where it's sort of in the Robert Reich time that gets kind of confused, because is all capitalism then fascism because it's Gordon Gekko, it's for making profit and money only, thinly covered up by PR or by somehow some kind of claim that the system as it is has a volunteer general bonus to it, so that the general will wants this, so that there's some kind of consensus around doing capitalism. Is there, or is it that just so I mean, part of the point I'm making is focusing on Trump then becomes deceptive, just as Zizek's old claims that one should push the principle. So say the principle is free enterprise, but the practice is always Gordon Gekko. And then at a certain point you say this is fetishism, and then Zizek gives up his universal human rights fetishism, and instead of saying we're going to push the principle, he tries to rush into some kind of Aimé Césaire total schizophrenic break. So I mentioned that particularly because who does the CIA dislike the most? It was people like Fanon and Aimé Césaire and a couple of people who didn't agree with the enlightened universalism, which is part of the American order at its beginning. Let's think about the American order at its beginning for a second. To have a break between every other... Yeah, I mean, this is the other thing I wanted to bring up. The notion that Trump is sort of seizing powers and making and getting rid of Montesquieu, getting rid of the jealousy of the each power against each power. I think what did Kelvin say? Something like you can only check power with power. You can't check it by reason and justice. You can't persuade people with power through reason and justice to give up power, but only check power with power. So therefore, there must be Montesquieu. There must be separation of powers. And then the accusation is Trump is must be a fascist because he's against the separation of powers, and he's seizing the power of the purse in various ways, like through the taxes, quote-unquote tariffs against Americans who want to buy things imported from other countries, through various emergency measures, through in his earlier presidency, through transferring money to the wall, through various means, through the possibly Reich also says through the Big Beautiful Bill for some reason, although that was passed by Article 1. But in any case, is this really in what sense is this fascist? So almost every government everywhere else and in all times has not had the Montesquieu system or the separation of powers So how could it be that in Japan, for instance, where they have a diet, and diet comes somehow from the word like dietia or something like that, which means something like regimen in Latin and Greek, or way of life, in the sense that I was trying to develop before, in the sense of that arte or fortitudo or virtue is an exercise regimen. So the diet or public assembly, the Japanese vote people into the diet or public assembly, and then just as Germany created Hitler as the unified chancellor in order to have consensus, the Japanese, as almost every country other than America, which wants to get things done, wants the trains to run, wants to be able to build high-speed trains, doesn't want the veto-ocracy, doesn't want the juristocracy where the lawyers are to stomp everything, but wants to get things done. The Japanese just put their leader in, so they just elected a leader who supposedly has Trumpian qualities, a woman. I don't remember the name. But the point is that in the Japanese system, the diet creates the leader. It's not voted in. We don't vote directly either because we have the electoral college. But in theory, it's like people act as though we do. But in a diet system or assembly or parliamentary system, you could get laws passed much more easily because the assembly itself creates its executive, and then the executive just comes back and says, make these laws for me, and they're all working together. Where in our system, everybody's vetoing everybody through whatever, by hook or by crook. But so is it really true that the system that most countries have used most of the time is automatically fascist, just because Trump is going more in the direction of a working government? So that's one area that one can say is under contestation here. The other thing is, of course, what I just said. How is fascism being used? Is it being used in this very broad way where fascism must be understood to exist at all times and in all places once there's a capitalist system in the sense of Wallerstein, so that every country has sort of fascist element all the time in the sense of the Gordon Geckos, in the sense of money and power as above the public good or whatever, and that it was only just interregnum when there was a civil war between America and Germany, and then there could be a long story on that. This question of the other funny thing he says is, the Junker class was the source of this evil racist tendency in the Prussians or whatever, out of which Bismarck emerged. But I think of Bismarck, what he reminds me of more is Hamilton, is like Bismarck married into the gentry out of the Junker class, was created first our prince, and it's sort of like Hamilton was kind of a self-made man, a lawyer, and then he's married into this old Dutch aristocratic family. So we should remember, we use the word German, but that's an exonym. It's a name. It's the outsider. The way the outsiders talk. And the endonym, or the way Germans call themselves, is Deutsch. So Deutsch and Dutch are almost the same. They're very closely related to the Dutch, who are at the fount of America in in the New Netherlands, in what became New York, and who basically became the Knickerbockers. Those families, those wealthy families who resisted and finally succumbed to the robber barons and the new wealth, were sort of Calvinists, were sort of new. I guess they were connected to the Reform Dutch Church. And Hamilton had married into that family, and that was probably a source of the reason why he was kind of a universalist, or for the federalist power rather than the Jeffersonian type of power. But because he wanted the bank, he wanted commerce, he wanted everything to flourish, he wanted the so-called fascist power. So notice how easily we can slip into this usage of fascism and project it everywhere. And notice how different, so they want to say, notice how different from the point of view of if you're thinking about doing philology, if you're thinking about keeping the text open in its most correct form, keeping contact with the history, then we have to say, we get a totally different result from saying fascism when the first proper use of the word is Giovanni Gentili's essay, which I'll try to include, than we do from using different forms of usage of this word with different definitions connected to them, which yield totally different